So the agenda is quite short and sweet. We'll give you a quick introduction to the Woodland Carbon Code, talk about what it is and how to get involved, followed by a summary of the Woodland Carbon Guarantee and how that works for schemes in England, and details around the next auction. So before we get into it, we just wanted to start with some of the key take-home messages. So if you only remember 3 things from this webinar, these are the ones that we feel are the most important. So they are that the Woodland Carbon Code is considered to be a high integrity code that is internationally recognised for high standards of sustainable forest and carbon management. You must register for the Woodland Carbon Code before planting in order to generate woodland carbon units, and that is even if you don't plan on selling them. But if you do intend to sell your units, the Woodland Carbon Code can provide an opportunity to generate long-term income from woodland creation projects. So we don't want you to miss out on this opportunity. So to start with, what is the Woodland Carbon Code? So the Woodland Carbon Code is the government-backed quality assurance standard for verified woodland creation projects in the UK. It was first developed by the government back in 2011, and it enables landowners to confidently quantify the amount of carbon dioxide being sequestered in new woodland creation projects, and then subsequently generate verified woodland carbon units from those projects. And these units can then either be used by landowners to make claims within their own carbon accounting, or those units could then be sold on the UK voluntary carbon market. And the Woodland Carbon Code uses globally recognised carbon assessment protocols and core principles, and these are endorsed by the International Carbon Reduction Offset Alliance. So because of this ensures that the carbon units that are generated meet very high integrity standards. The projects are verified by third parties, and this makes sure that they demonstrate transparency and evidence-based methodologies to back up any of the claims that are made. And this helps provide confidence that the projects are delivering genuinely permanent removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And as a result of this, the woodland carbon units are in quite high demand. And this is because buyers really value that high integrity. And so this can help to then provide a significant extra income stream for woodland owners alongside potential grant or timber income as well. So the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change views the use of greenhouse gas removals as really crucial to achieving net zero alongside significant emissions reductions. And the UK government has a legally binding target for net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. But there are also an increasing number of businesses that are voluntarily setting net zero or carbon neutrality targets. And these are organisations that essentially want to do the right thing, but also will be coming under pressure from investors or consumers to show that how that they're performing in response to the climate crisis. So these organisations will be setting science-based targets to reduce their emissions as much as possible to align with a 1.5 degree warming pathway. However, there will still be some residual emissions throughout their decarbonisation journey that are really difficult to abate. And they can compensate for these by investing in nature-based solutions, such as woodland creation projects, that are generating high quality woodland carbon units, which is where the Woodland Carbon Code can come in. So one woodland carbon unit equates to 1 tonne of carbon dioxide equivalent that's removed from the atmosphere. And these organisations can buy these units on the voluntary carbon market from verified Woodland Carbon Code projects to work towards their net zero targets. So that was a really brief summary of the demand side of the market. But from the supply side, there are a number of things that landowners and woodland creation projects need to be aware of in order to be eligible for the Woodland Carbon Code. So the first thing they need to do is register with the code before any work begins on site. And this is called the project implementation date. And projects can't register with the code if they've already started work. So that could include fencing, deer control, ground preparation or planting. So that's a really key thing to remember. The land cannot have been wooded in the last 25 years. So you can't register restock sites to the Woodland Carbon Code. The landowner also has to commit to a permanent land use change to woodland, which is one of the key carbon principles around permanence, ensuring the integrity of the code. As with all forestry projects, it has to be compliant with UKFS and EIA rules, and it also has to abide by the Forestry Act. So if at any point they're going to be felling trees, you will need a felling licence as standard. And another really key eligibility requirement is additionality. So additionality essentially involves proving that the carbon sequestration within the project is over and above that which would have happened anyway in the absence of the market. So what does that actually mean in practice? So ultimately, it means that if you want to enter the Woodland Carbon Code, you have to prove that the woodland wouldn't have been planted had it not been for the incentivisation of that potential carbon income through the voluntary carbon market. And this is really essential to the integrity of the Woodland Carbon Code, and it can help to prevent claims of greenwashing and ensures that buyers of carbon units can have confidence in the market and confidence in what they're buying. There are over 20 different ways of assessing additionality globally, but within the Woodland Carbon Code, we have two tests. The legal test, which just means that planting must not be a legal requirement. So, for example, restock sites or compensating for development or open habitat restoration. And the investment test. And this is where you need to prove that either forestry is not the most economically or financially attractive option on that piece of land, or the project couldn't have gone ahead without that carbon financing. So both of these tests need to be passed in order to be additional. And there are tools such as the cash flow sheet and templates that we have to support with that. Additionality is quite a complex topic, and we don't have much time today to delve into it in much detail, but we will be running webinars in the future around these key eligibility requirements. So there will be an opportunity to discuss this in more detail and answer any questions that you have. Okay, I'm going to pass over now to Emma, who's going to talk us through some of the calculations.
Thanks very much, Annie. So yeah, I'm just going to talk about a bit more about how the Woodland Carbon Code really works and get into the nitty-gritty a bit more. So before you plant a woodland, you will need to calculate its carbon sequestration potential. So we have Excel spreadsheets that can do that for you, or if you'd like a bit of help using them and getting all the other necessary documentation together, you can choose to work with a project developer, and you can find details of those on the Woodland Carbon Code website. So through the Excel sheets, we model how much carbon we would expect a woodland creation project to sequester, and we can do that up to 100 years. And so that allows us to predict how much carbon a woodland will sequester over time. So this chart here on this slide is just an example of the total carbon sequestration potential of a woodland. So we've got time along the x-axis with the cumulative amount of carbon on the y-axis. So the blue and green colours combined here show the total amount of carbon, but just to be aware that 20% of units will be taken from all Woodland Carbon Code projects, and they're put into a buffer to protect anyone who's already bought units and made claims against them. But the remaining 80% represents the carbon that you can actually sell. So you'll see right at the start here, there are some negative emissions. So we call that the carbon debt, and that's for things like transporting any trees, preparing the ground, installing fencing, anything that will mean that carbon is emitted. But over time, as the woodland grows, that debt will be paid back and the woodland will begin to sequester more carbon. Now the curve here is very steep at the beginning when the woodland is young, and at which point the growth rate is much quicker. And the growth begins to slow down a bit, and in this example it's around about year 20. So the woodland is still sequestering carbon after that point, just at a slower rate. So how do you sell that carbon? Now in the Woodland Carbon Code, the saleable saleable goods are called units, and there are two types of unit. We have pending issuance units, or PIUs, and woodland carbon units, or WCUs. And 1 unit is equal to 1 tonne of carbon. Now, as we've just seen, we calculate how many tonnes of carbon are expected to be sequestered at the beginning of a project, and so that tells us how many PIUs we have. So you should think of a PIU as a bit like a promise to sequester carbon at some point in the future, and a buyer can plan to offset their future emissions by buying PIUs now. So every 10 years, you will have to go through a verification process to check the growth of the woodland and check that it's growing as expected, as we modelled in our initial calculations. And that process will confirm whether that tonne of carbon, so that PIU, has been sequestered yet or not. Once that's confirmed, it will be converted into a WCU. Now, only WCUs can be used to offset. You can't use PIUs to offset because a PIU represents a tonne of carbon that hasn't been sequestered yet. So you can't make any claims against PIUs. You can only make claims against WCUs. So when PIUs are calculated at the beginning of a project, they're assigned a vintage year, and that is the year that they are expected to be sequestered by the woodland and converted into a WCU. So you can sell your units to buyers and they will know when they can use those to offset. So I've just mentioned verification. So I'll just explain a bit more about what that and the other terms mean by going through this timeline for you. So the very first thing that you have to do if you want to enter the Woodland Carbon Code is to register your project. You have to do that before planting, otherwise you can't enter the Woodland Carbon Code and you can't sell any carbon units. And that's free, registration is free. And then within 3 years after planting, you have to validate, and that involves submitting documents, so like the carbon calculator that we just discussed and the cash flow spreadsheet that Annie mentioned, submitting those documents to the validator. There are 2 validators. We work with the Soil Association and Organic Farmers and Growers, and there is a fee associated to validate. At year 5, you will verify for the first time with one of those 2 validating bodies, and they will come in to check that your woodland is growing as expected and enable the conversion of PIUs to WCUs. There's also a fee for verification. And you have to repeat that verification process at least every 10 years thereafter and pay the associated fee at those points. So I have mentioned costs. Costs do vary between the 2 validators and between projects. So I'm not going to go into specific details about costs here, but you can find out a bit more from the validators and from project developers directly if you're interested. So this slide here is just really to highlight the points at which costs are expected. So firstly, the UK Land Carbon Registry. All projects and all buyers have to register here, but that's free for projects, although for buyers there is a one-off fee to register. At validation, you have to pay the validator for their services, plus a small fee to list PIUs on the UK Land Carbon Registry. And then the validator also charges a fee at verification points, plus a small fee to convert PIUs into WCUs. So this slide here is really just to illustrate the kind of income you might expect from selling your units. There's not really like a going rate for units because their value is dependent on quite a significant number of different factors. So for example, the vintage of the PIU, so discussed the vintage in a previous slide. If the vintage is sooner than 2050, which is a very popular date for net zero claims to be made by, compared to after 2050, a PIU with a sooner vintage might be worth more to a buyer. If you are choosing to sell your units after they've been verified, so if you're selling them as WCUs, they might also fetch a higher price because buyers can use them to offset immediately. Things like whether the project delivers well on additional benefits. So things like biodiversity, or having benefits for water quality, or for people to be able to access the woodland. If buyers value additional benefits, they might want to pay more for a unit. Location is important as well. Location is a really big factor actually in units that fetch higher prices. Companies who are investing in carbon offsetting want to show off the effort they're putting into sustainability. So they might choose a project closer to their operations so that they can show it off to customers and investors. So really a huge number of different things that might affect price. So that's why we talk about it as a range. So a range of maybe 10 to 50 pounds per unit, and a typical broadleaf scheme in England might expect to sequester about 500 units per hectare over a 100-year period. And that gives you a potential income of between about £5,000 per hectare and £25,000 per hectare over 100 years. And finally, just to round off with some things that landowners should be aware of if they're thinking about entering the code. So firstly, it is up to the landowner to replant in case of catastrophe. And that's for things like fire. You can manage your woodland in such a way as to diminish that risk, but it's just to be aware that if catastrophe does happen, you will need to replant the trees to maintain adherence to the Woodland Carbon Code. As discussed, you have to verify at least every 10 years, and just to make the point really that there is a cost to verify at those points. And lastly, you will need to manage your project as per your initial carbon calculations and management plan. So you need to declare up front whether you're planning on doing anything like clear felling or thinning your woodland, because if you end up doing that but you haven't declared it at the beginning, you will have overestimated the carbon that you are projecting, which it just isn't of any benefit to anyone. So you just need to think about how you will manage your woodland project before you plant. And now I'll pass over to Chris, who's going to talk about the Woodland Carbon Guarantee.
Great, thanks, Emma. Hopefully I've managed to take control. Can you just say that I have?
You have.
Great, thank you. So moving on, we said it was going to be a whistle-stop tour of the Woodland Carbon Code, and it already has been, because I am now going to talk about the Woodland Carbon Guarantee, which is an English scheme which was launched in 2019. It was launched in order to develop the private sector woodland carbon market and encourage woodland creation in England. As such, it's probably not of any interest to anybody in Scotland or Wales or Northern Ireland, but it is only for land within England, and it cannot be land that's owned by public bodies. We operate reverse auctions, so that government receives value for money on its investments, and the contracts are typically until 2055, 2056, with a guaranteed index payment for woodland carbon units as the trees grow. So we will not buy pending issuance units. We will only buy woodland carbon units. That's carbon that's sequestered into trees. So as such, you still, as a woodland owner, as an investor, you still have the option to sell your units on the private market. If you have not sold the units on the private market, you can return to the government and say, I have units to sell. I have a contract with the government in order to sell my units to you. There's more information on the Woodland Carbon Guarantee site on gov.uk. We'll share the slides and the recording when this is over. And that link will take you through to the page, but you can look it up on gov.uk. The process is very similar to the Woodland Carbon Code validation process. you register with the Woodland Carbon Code, and then you apply for the Woodland Carbon Guarantee auction. You will be given a PIN number which allows you to participate in the auction as long as your project meets the registration requirements of the Woodland Carbon Code. If you're successful, you will receive a note saying you have been successful. You then plant your woodland and validate it under the Woodland Carbon Guarantee just as normal, and verify at years 5, 15, 25 up until 55, 56. And in each of those verification points, you have the opportunity to sell your units to your Woodland Carbon units to the government for the fixed price, which is index linked to inflation, the CPI, which means that your price will go up over time, but only in respect of inflation. So, what have the auction results yielded so far? Well, you can see there that the price is round about, give or take, £20, £21. Our auctions have been relatively successful in terms of attracting people, and they are a competitive auction, and there's more detail on the Woodland Carbon Code, the Woodland Carbon Guarantee website as to how they run, but the price there should not be taken as a firm indicator of acceptable bids. Our next auction is coming up, auction 8. You need to register for that auction by 11:59 on September. The auction 8 will run from the 23rd to the 29th of September 2024. If you have a project now that you have registered with the Woodland Carbon Code but you have not implemented, you can apply for a position in the Woodland Carbon Guarantee auction. The reserve price for woodland creation projects which have funding is £30 per tonne. For the other auction part, that which is non-grant funded woodland, there is a higher price which we are not disclosing. Again, look at the Woodland Carbon Guarantee website pages for further information, but we'd be happy to field questions on that both now and afterwards. So our core message is, again, the Woodland Carbon Code is a high integrity code. Well, you'd expect us to say that, but you can see that, well, we think it is a high integrity code. It's internationally recognised for high standards of sustainable forest and carbon management. You must register for the Woodland Carbon Code before planting to generate woodland carbon units, even if you don't plan to sell them. If you don't register, you can't join the market. Don't miss the opportunity for a long-term income from private finance. Thank you, and any questions? I'll stop sharing.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Emma. Thank you, Annie. That was a really helpful and interesting overview of the Woodland Carbon Code. We've got quite a lot of questions that have come into the chat area. I think Annie and Emma have been answering some of them. Are there any that haven't been answered that you would like to pick up on at all to reply to?
I just saw one flash up then, so it's probably the last one in the queue, but I'll take it first because it looked like a nice and simple one. Minimum size, there isn't a minimum size apart from that which is stipulated by our grants at the moment, which is 1 hectare per holding, and that in that 1 hectare, the grants, the size of a block has to be 0.1 of a hectare. It's priced in general that you can achieve for the carbon unit that limits the size, the down size, the minimum size of your application. But we find in general that projects that are applying on their own, as not as part of a group, that are below 3 hectares, with the prices as they are, don't generally tend to wash their face. So you don't generally tend to make money on a project that is below 3 hectares if you are registering it on its own.
Great, thank you, Chris. We've got a couple of questions on the topic of stacking. Anyone like to pick them up?
If you can read them out, I can't actually see them.
Yeah, sure. Okay. Are there plans to create a stackable carbon and biodiversity unit? For example, like the one in the Wilder Carbon Standard? And also, can the units be stacked with ELMs?
I'll take the first part of that, definitely. At the moment, woodland carbon units cannot be stacked with biodiversity units because there is a definite doubt, because biodiversity units are generated from development. There is confusion and doubt over whether there will be any net carbon benefit from the development, because there's no standardized ways of actually accounting for carbon in developments. So we don't think at the moment that you can stack, and unless it is some kind of biodiversity extra that you're trying to do from UCO, you can't stack biodiversity with carbon credits. I don't know how Wilder Carbon managed to do it. I'm not in control of their process, so I can't comment on Wilder Carbon. The second part of that.
Sorry, Chris, can I just add to that one a little
Yeah,
bit? So yeah, Chris is correct in saying that can't mix compliance and voluntary markets, but there is a project going on at the IUCN at the moment to investigate whether a voluntary biodiversity unit can be created to work with the Woodland Carbon Code. So there might be potential to do that in the future.
Yeah, excellent. I've totally forgotten that, but yes, only if it's a voluntary market unit. What was the second part of that question, Susan? Was it ELM?
ELM, yes.
At the moment, you can stack you can use or generate woodland carbon units from the England Woodland Creation offer. England Woodland Creation offer will be part of the ELM offer in England, and so therefore you will be able to stack in the future with woodland carbon units, and if you are using government grant.
That's great. And can you just tell us what ELM stands for as well?
Sorry, ELM is the Environmental Land Management Programme.
Great, thank you. That's great. We've got a question from Lindsay asking, how do I validate?
Annie or Emma?
I'm happy to take that one. Yes, so to validate your project, that is what happens. Emma explained, it happens after planting. So once you've finished planting the project, you validate by submitting a series of documents to one of our third-party accreditors. So that's either the Soil Association or the Organic Farmers and Growers. It's at validation stage that you'll submit your cash flow sheet that assesses your financial additionality. There's also your project design document that you'll need to complete that explains your woodland creation and how you're going to manage it going forwards. And it also looks at the other benefits of the project. And at that point, you also then redo your Woodland Carbon Code calculation using the calculator. So if there's been any changes from when you first registered, sort of slightly different species mix or design, you recalculate that, and you'll need to make sure that if you're recalculating the amount of predicted units, you re-enter those into the cash flow sheet so that it all aligns. And then you'll submit that through the Scottish Forestry Woodland Carbon Code Secretariat, and through the accreditors, who will then assess the project, potentially visit the site, and then once they're happy, they'll give you a validation statement, which will show all of the pending issuance units, which Emma went through, which will show you the predicted carbon sequestration of that project for the entire duration. So hopefully that will make sense. There is a page on the Woodland Carbon Code website that goes through the entire process on validation, and there's some quite useful guidance on there as well.
Great, thank you, Annie. Peter Smith has asked, in modelling carbon sequestration, do you value higher carbon woodland soils, such as wet, peaty soils for woodland creation?
So the Forestry Commission wouldn't support planting on peaty soils because of the high carbon loss associated with disturbing the soil and planting woodlands on there. So we do ask about that in the calculator. So you can choose the option about what sort of soil you're planting on. So mineral, organomineral, or organic. And we wouldn't support planting on organic soils.
Thanks, Emma. And Brian has asked, does modelling of carbon price vary over time, i.e. early years capture more carbon over shorter time before the capture rate flattens?
Can you repeat that?
Yeah, so Brian's wondering if the modelling of carbon price varies over time with the kind of rate of sequestration of trees as they grow.
Price probably is something that is, well, within the Woodland Carbon Code, price is something which is fairly consistent, I think. Although and the more transactions there are over time, the more certain we will be of what the average price for carbon units in the voluntary market is. And we've done a little bit of work around this with Scottish Forestry to try to ascertain a carbon price, and that is on that the results of that are on the website. Emma was talking about how price varies the closer you come to 2050, but also the price of a unit will vary with respect to the purchaser the closer they come to being usable. At the moment, a pending issuance unit issued for 2000 or 2120 is probably worth about 10 pence, but a unit issued for 2045 may be worth a lot more than that, maybe £30. So or more. So there is a difference in the price that you see and observe in earlier vintages than in ones that are far distant. But as such, until we know what the voluntary market price on average is, it's going to be very difficult for us to actually do much modelling around how price changes. But it's something I think we'd probably be interested in talking to somebody about, so that we have more intelligence over how things might change.
Great, thank you. We have a question from Stuart on additionality He's wondering, is the requirement that forestry is not the most economically or most financially attractive option?
Yes, that's correct. So the cash flow sheet will look at the income that's expected from the woodland without carbon, and then it will also look at the costs associated with that. So that will create a net present value for that woodland without carbon income, and it will compare that to the net present value of the existing land use on that piece of land. So you'll enter the sort of specifics for your land and for your project, and then it will provide a calculation that will let you know whether you've essentially passed or failed that additionality test based on, I guess, the amount of grant income you might be receiving, the amount of timber income you might be receiving, and then also looking at the income foregone from the existing land use on that piece of land. Hopefully that answers the question.
Great, thank you. Karina's reposted her questions. So she's asking about integrated sustainable woodland / forestry management. She's asking why it's not been integrated into the code. She's giving an example of why does the unthinned model sequester more carbon?
Okay, I think I'll try and take this one. The Woodland Carbon Code doesn't include harvested wood products in its calculations. It looks at additionality from the point of view of whether you need carbon funding for your project, and it looks at your income over time, and the income you get from harvested wood products, timber, is included within that calculation. We also have no mechanism for tracking where and how harvested wood products are used in the marketplace, insofar as where the carbon actually ends up being stored. So it is really difficult for that for us to find a mechanism for working that out. I don't think it's impossible, it's just difficult. That is also something which you probably look at as being a substitution code rather than a woodland carbon, or part of the Woodland Carbon Code. So you're using the harvested wood products to substitute for high embedded carbon products like concrete and steel. So again, the code deals with the woodland, with the carbon that is sequestered and stored long term in that woodland, not the carbon that leaves the forest gate and goes into the marketplace. That would require a separate mechanism. It's not one that we're intentionally not wanting to look at. It's just one that we haven't yet been able to crack or find out how you might predict with newly planted woodlands, how you might predict how where that timber planted, let's say today in 2024, might be used at the end of this century. So I'm not going to sort of say that we are going to look at it. We might, but it might be simpler to look at a harvested wood product substitution code that looks at how you substitute within construction. So moving on to the second part of the question about why the code actively encourages people not to plant broadleaves at tighter spacings. I don't think it does, to be honest. I think it will take what you as a landowner planter will want to do and fit it within the models that we have, if you're going to plant really tightly with broadleaves, then that is your favoured management mechanism. What I would suggest it happens then is that you actually model it the closest you can get. It's a prediction, after all. The Woodland Carbon Code just gives you a prediction with its carbon calculators. The real sort of evidence happens at verification, when you go out on site and are measuring the volume of carbon stored in your woodland, and the code will try to mold around what you predict. So I don't take it that we don't encourage people to plant at tighter spacings. We use the evidence that we have available from the lookup tables and from many years of monitoring woodland stands, and use that in our models. It may well be that you get to net zero a lot quicker with very tightly spaced broadleaf trees. Those trees will be potentially grown very thin and spindly, which will need thinning, yes, and they will take and that woodland will, or that timber will be removed from the woodland, and as I explained earlier on, taken into the harvested wood products market, for which you will be paid. So that is part of what we look at and assess in additionality, and whether the project becomes part of a recognised carbon project.
Great, thank you very much, Chris. So I think we're just about out of time. There are maybe one or two questions we didn't quite get to. Yeah, we'll do our best to answer them, and as we make that available after today's event. But yes, all that's left for me to do today is to really thank everybody for coming along today. We've had a really good discussion there, some very interesting questions. And thanks to our presenters, Annie, Emma and Chris, for doing a brilliant job of a whistle-stop tour of the Woodland Carbon Code. If you're interested in anything that we've touched on here, please do get in touch with us at info@woodlandcarboncode.org, and we can get back to you on that. And just before we finish up, I'd like to highlight we do have another webinar coming up next month on the 27th of August, and that's on the subject of natural regeneration. So please do check the Woodland Carbon Code website and our newsletter for details on that. But yes, thanks everyone for coming, and thanks for a really interesting session. And take care, and we hope to see you again soon.
Thanks everyone. See you soon.
Thank you, Susan. Thanks everyone.
Thank you. Bye.